Good evening, afternoon, or morning, everyone. Welcome to the public defense of my PhD thesis. For those who don't know me, my name is Pavan. Until recently, I worked towards a thesis for a little over 4 years at IDIAP Research Institute and EPFL. The work is on automatic speech assessment and novel methods of incorporating prior knowledge into those systems. This was largely supervised by Dr. Matthew Magamados and by Professor Harvey Bollard. So today I'll be first introducing what speech assessment is, followed by a brief discussion on what the existing methods are, followed by what this thesis contributed. We will then briefly look at one of the prominent contributions, which is end-to-end acoustic modeling. Finally, I will present the conclusions of the thesis. So what is speech assessment? When a person speaks to another person, the listener can assess several kinds of information from speech. It could be about the spoken message, like how it was spoken. They can identify the speaker, the spoken language, and the dialect. They can identify how fluent or proficient the speaker is in this language. They can also detect whether the speaker is feeling sleepy or drunk, which we refer to as the social state. They could sense if the speaker is feeling a specific emotion or is depressed. The speaker and the listener can be a human or a machine. This leads to different scenarios: human-to-human communication mediated through machines, or human-to-machine communication, or machine-to-human communication. In the future, a scenario could happen where machines-to-machines communication is happening. It is also worth mentioning that in principle, speech communication is a bimodal communication, audio and visual expressions. In this thesis, we focus on audio modality, although video could be helpful. There are several notions in the literature regarding this assessment of communicated aspects from speech. The notions are all fragmented, but we can categorize them broadly into three: intelligibility, quality, and speaker traits or traits. Speaker states or traits. This thesis considers all of them broadly as speech assessment. There are no clear boundaries between these notions. Intelligibility is about the spoken message. How many sound units can you hear correctly? Quality refers to multiple aspects that can be quantified: how much or how well on a continuous or ordinal scale. Like how natural does a text-to-speech synthesizer sound? How much listening effort is needed to hear speech over a telephone or wireless channel? How fluent or sleepy a person is. This could also be fluency and sleepiness could also be speaker traits. Speaker states are short-term attributes and traits are more longer term. For example, identifying the dialect of a person and emotion are all short-term states. I'm calling them as separate from quality because these are categorical. That means there are one of n. Depression detection, which is binary, could be a little more longer term, and speech pathologies could be further long term. Fluency could be also long term, and sleepiness could be short term, like a day or less. Another line of distinction we can draw is by using verbal and non-verbal cues. So the cues associated with speech assessment can be of two kinds, which are explicitly verbal and not explicitly verbal. In this thesis, we refer to textual cues such as word or phone transcriptions as explicit verbal cues. And the term paralinguistic aspects or everything else, such as acoustic properties, as non-explicitly verbal. For example, intelligibility can be measured by recognizing words or phone units and comparing them to text references, which are explicit verbal cues, whereas it can also be measured using acoustic embeddings such as I vectors and correlating them directly with the human-rated intelligibility scores. This is not explicitly verbal. Similarly, dialects can be identified by grammar or grammatical structures such as n-gram statistics or word frequencies, which are verbal cues, whereas they can also be recognized using I vectors or acoustic variations from the speech data, which are not explicitly verbal cues. Similarly, fluency can be measured by grammatical correctness. This is verbal cues, whereas it can also be measured by measuring how many times the speaker paused or for how long they paused and how did they alter their pitch while they spoke, which are not explicitly verbal. Similarly, depression can be detected by using word embeddings, which are verbal cues, whereas they can also be detected by using acoustic properties, which are non-verbal. Sorry. So there are two aspects why we want to not rely on explicit verbal cues. The first thing is the transcriptions require significant additional time, effort, and money. And in the second case, in today's world, the privacy of users' data is of a concern. And by not using text transcripts, we will be preserving one modality at least. So let's look at the existing methods for automatic speech assessment. So intelligibility is assessed using spectrum-based methods, where the utterance under test is compared against reference in terms of its spectral properties to compute a score that correlates with intelligibility. One specific example is short-time objective intelligibility, or STOI, and another example is perceptual evaluation of speech quality, which was initially proposed for speech quality but also works for intelligibility. I'm not going into details of it. The other class of methods use speech recognition to transcribe the test acoustic signals and compare them against a reference transcription to get an edit distance score or word error rate, which correlates with intelligibility. There's a third class of methods that operate at an intermediate level using phone posterior probability representations from an acoustic artificial neural network model. The tester trains posterior probabilities are compared against the reference using dynamic time warping, where a local cost based on Kullback-Leibler divergence is computed and cumulated and normalized to compute a final score that correlates inversely with intelligibility. Several assessment tasks are carried out using non or no explicit verbal cues, where the speech signals are passed through a feature extractor followed by a classifier. The feature extractor could be a fixed length feature representation extractor, which could be at utterance level. And the classifier could be a simple support vector machine or a linear discriminant analysis or a neural network. Let's look at the feature extraction part in a little more detail. Some tasks have a specific set of handcrafted features. For instance, vocal source biomarkers for depression that captures the variability in pitch frequency, especially in terms of the amplitude and frequency that capture tremble in the voice and the degree of aspiration. But several tasks have no such features. So people use a large set of generic paralinguistic features known as low-level descriptors, or LLDs. One such set is the extended Geneva minimalistic acoustic parameter set, which is shown here. These are short-time features, and so they need to be aggregated at an utterance level using statistical moments such as mean, standard deviation, skewness, and kurtosis over time. These are known as functionals in the literature. Another way to aggregate the information at utterance level is by using bag of audio words. These are obtained by vector quantizing the short-time features. These could be any features, not necessarily LLDs, and counting the occurrences within the utterance. In this example, there are 5 frames belonging to the blue cluster or the blue code word or the blue audio word, and 2 frames belong to the red audio word, and so on. These counts normalized gives a fixed length representation. To give an example, if the short-time features capture the smooth spectral envelope of the speech signal, then the audio word clusters largely correspond to phones. And the bag of audio words gives the relative counts of phones and silences here. More recently, embeddings such as especially neural embeddings are being used as feature representations. In the discriminative approach, short-time features are passed through a neural network that usually contains statistics pooling layer as an intermediate layer, which computes the first and second order moments of the non-linearly transformed features over time. So these intermediate representations can be seen as a more sophisticated version of LLDs that we have seen before, or functionals that we have seen before. The network is generally trained to discriminate certain classes. For instance, if it is dialect identification, we have dialect classes at the output of the neural network. And then we use cross-entropy laws to train this neural network. After training, the intermediate representations can be used as features. In a generative approach, there can be I vectors or sequence-to-sequence autoencoder features. So sequence-to-sequence encoder representations are unsupervised neural embeddings, where the short-time features are encoded using an encoder to give a fixed length hidden representation HT, and from which the decoder tries to decipher the entire sequence C These Z's are trained to be as close as possible to the original X's. Once this network is trained, this HT can be used as the feature. Now let us look at the contributions of the thesis. As we discussed earlier, what currently exists for speech assessment is a feature extraction block followed by a classifier. But in the recent years, end-to-end raw waveform modeling approaches have been shown to improve the modeling in phone classification, speaker verification, gender identification, and several other tasks. Such methods use minimal prior knowledge to learn task-dependent information, such as format-related information in the case of speech recognition and source-related information in the case of speaker verification. Here, we study whether such end-to-end learning methods are viable for automatic speech assessment using minimal prior knowledge. We investigate this approach on dialect identification, fluency prediction, and depression detection, and found that it is indeed viable. We then investigate how to incorporate more prior knowledge into the systems, and we discuss this more in the next section. So this is the first contribution. The second contribution lies in intelligibility estimation framework that we have seen previously. The framework consists of comparing two phone posterior probability sequences that are estimated from an ANN. The contribution lies in its training. This ANN is the same as the acoustic model that is employed in hybrid HMM or hidden Markov model based speech recognition systems. In this case, the reference sequence comes from the transcriptions where words are first converted into a sequence of phonemes and further into state sequence by assuming a left to right hidden Markov model. So the sequence y1 to yj represents one hot vectors corresponding to HMM states. The training consists of two steps, expectation step or E step that finds the frame to state alignment indicated by this blue path, and a maximization step that updates the ANN parameters given these pairs of y and z's using a frame level cross entropy cost function. This cost is the same as Kullback-Leibler divergence between reference and test sequences. However, this frame level cost ignores the sequential nature of the frames. Hence, we propose that we use cost functions that are constructed from segments. In this example shown, let's say the speech signal carries the message, this is the idea, which is broken down into phones and further into states. This shows the state 2, which is aligned, this shows the state 2 that's aligned with 3 frames, or maybe state 2 of IH, which is aligned with 4 frames. We showed that confidence measures of segments can be used as training cost functions, where the segments can be states or phones, and demonstrated that such training improves speech recognition as well as dysarthric speech intelligibility assessment. The third contribution lies in the context of privacy preservation, which is an emerging research problem. Speech is a direct identifier of a person. With the advancement of speech technologies in the presence of public speech resources, there has been an increased interest in preserving the speaker's identity or privacy. Thus, the objective of speech anonymization is to obfuscate the speaker identity and retain the spoken content and other aspects. This is an emerging field, so there's also a need to develop such anonymization methods as well as to assess the resultant speech in several aspects. This process of anonymization and assessment has to happen in a loop for the field to advance. Our contribution is a novel anonymization approach based on knowledge that the first 2 formants carry phonetic information, and the later formants are more sensitive to speaker differences. And suprasegmental information is related to change of speaking rate. So here in this example, in this illustration that I have shown, the speech of a speaker is passed through a characteristics estimator in the proposed approach, where the characteristics of the speaker are obtained and then they are hidden. And once, so we have a block which is a pseudonymization, where the correct characteristics and the different characteristics are given so that the speech is anonymized. So this speech sounds like a different or not like the same person, but with the same spoken content. The same block can also be used to de-pseudonymize. That means we can use the original speaker's characteristics and then get the speech that sounds like the original speaker again. So this method, what we proposed, was compared with two baseline systems. One is neural source filtering based method, and the other one is McAdams method. I'm going to give a slight introduction into what these are. The first one is neural source filtering, where the input speech is decomposed into three components. One is F0, which is fundamental frequency. The second component is the phonetic information, which is related to phones or acoustic information, which is ASR acoustic model is used to extract bottleneck features. And the third one is related to the speaker, which are X vectors, which are speaker embeddings. So this model takes the phone level information, F0, and then uses a different speaker's embedding to get anonymized speech. The second method is a very simple method where linear prediction analysis is used, where the linear prediction coefficients or the poles are altered by using a power, which is alpha. And then once the poles are altered, it gives a spectrum which is scaled non-linearly in the spectral domain. And then the speech is resynthesized to get anonymized speech. So the method was compared with these two baseline systems, and then it was validated in terms of three kinds of methods. One is ABX listening experiments, where people were asked to rate whether the anonymous speech was different from the other speech or not. The second method is automatic methods using speech recognition and speaker verification. The third one was not evaluated by us. It was evaluated by the challenge which organized, which is called Voice Privacy Challenge, which organized this challenge. And the measures were intelligibility, quality, and speaker linkability. What we found was that the approach is viable for pseudonymization. So let us look at, so these are the three contributions, and then let us look at one of the contributions, which is end-to-end acoustic modeling. End-to-end acoustic modeling was initially proposed in 2016 or maybe earlier, where there were two PhD theses that went into this end-to-end acoustic modeling for different speech tasks, where a raw speech signal is passed through a cascade of convolutional layers followed by fully connected neural network layers. And then the classes of interest are at the output of the neural network, and then it is trained by just backpropagating the cross entropy loss. So there are some parameters of this neural network that can be controlled and then used. The first one is called the kernel width of the first layer. If we have a kernel width that is about 2 milliseconds or less than pitch period, it is called subsegmental modeling, where it models short time information at a precise level. And if the kernel width is longer, which is about 20 milliseconds or 1 to 5 pitch periods, it captures a long-term information, which could be more related to the vocal source. So in these systems, our challenge was to introduce speech production based knowledge because the system uses minimal prior knowledge. So how do we go about doing that is by the basics of speech production knowledge, where the speech is assumed to be a convolution of two components. One is the excitation signal, which is U of n, which is the source, and which is the air coming from the lungs, which is modulated by the vocal tract of the shape V of n. The impulse response is V of n. So speech is a convolution of these two signals. But given a speech signal, it is not perfectly possible to estimate U of n and V of n together, but it is possible to approximate them. So what we tried to do, the first method we tried to introduce in this end-to-end acoustic modeling was to use knowledge-driven signal processing, where we use several techniques such as low-pass filtering, Kepstrom-based decomposition, linear prediction-based source filter decomposition, and zero-frequency filtering to filter out the unwanted components of speech, and then pass these signals through the neural network and then learn this neural network. I'm not getting into details of them, could look them up, and these are quite standard methods. The other line of research that we've conducted was by using transfer learning, where we incorporated linguistic knowledge. For example, dialect identification can benefit from linguistic resources, where, for example, if there is a transcription in the form of words or phonemes, one can compute word frequencies or n-gram statistics or measure pronunciation variations and determine the dialect. But when such resources are not available, we generally learn this information from another task that has the resources, and then use these model parameters to initialize the task of our interest. So let us look at it more closely. Conventionally, an acoustic model is built to map raw waveforms or acoustic feature representations to phonemic classes, which is typically used in speech recognition systems. These are specific to a language. However, one could also use articulatory properties of the vocal apparatus, such as manner. So these constitute of manner of articulation, such as stops, plosives, fricatives, place of articulation, such as where the tongue causes obstruction, such as alveoli or of teeth, palate of the mouth. It could also be the height of the tongue while producing the sound, and vowel categories. These are called, we call them articulatory properties, and these properties are generally mapped from phonemes deterministically using a lookup table. So such articulatory representations were shown to be multilingually portable. That means the source and the target tasks can be of different languages. And these are also more robust to noise, is what was shown before. So here we first learn articulatory representations directly from raw waveforms using neural networks, and then transfer learn these parameters for automatic speech assessment. I'll give you one or two tasks where we experimental results on these tasks. The first task is dialect identification, where given a spoken utterance, we need to classify the dialect. The annotations given for this data set, I'll talk about the data set. The annotations are dialect labels per utterance, and there are no transcriptions. So there are utterances and then their dialect labels. The data set consists of 3,000 hours of, almost 3,000 hours of training data corresponding to 17 dialects, which is broadcast news. And for evaluation, we have two sets. One is dev set and the other one is test set. I'm going to show the results on the test set. So there are three systems that we have compared. The first one is the baseline provided by the organizers that we did not build. The input consists of multi-frequency capsule coefficients, which is a standard feature set, followed by the neural network architecture that has 4 convolution layers, a statistics pooling layer that I have described before, and 2 feed-forward layers, and then a softmax layer. These are the two systems that we have built. One is MFCC TDNN systems, which is MFCC-based system trained on time delay neural networks. So this is based on X vector system that is popular in CALDI. CALDI is a toolkit for speech recognition and other speech-related tasks. The architecture consists of 5 time delay neural network layers, one statistics pooling layer, and then one feed-forward layer. And the backend is a probabilistic linear discriminant analysis, which does log likelihood ratio based classification. The proposed method consists of raw speech CNNs, which are where the inputs are just raw speech utterances. It has 10 convolution layers, one statistics pooling layer, and one feed-forward layer, and then followed by a softmax layer of 17 dialect classes. For articulatory learning, we have English corpus, which is AMI meeting corpus. It is about 77 hours of data. Phone to frame alignments were obtained by using Gaussian mixture model based models, specifically subspace GMMs using context dependent phones. And then once we have the phones, we map them to articulatory mappings using a deterministic knowledge using a lookup table. The architecture has 10 layer CNN similar to raw CNN, but has very few parameters because the source task has only 77 hours of data. So we have 1.7 million parameters compared to 21 million parameters that we have used previously. So these are the results. Several results are here. I'm going to present a few. The first one is comparing with the MFCC based initialization or the baseline system that was provided by the organizers and the two baselines that we have trained. The first one is MFCC TDNN system, which gave around 80.8% compared to the 82 that the organizers obtained using CNNs. And then what we proposed was around 82, which is close to the baseline what they have given with raw speech CNNs. And then when we used transfer learning, we obtained similar performances, whereas the most improvement that we've seen was by fusing these systems, where we fused the outputs of the four networks. So in the case of TDNN systems, what we used is we concatenated the embeddings and then used PLDA systems on them. Whereas for raw speech CNNs, we used the posterior probabilities and then we averaged them to make a decision. And then what we have also found out that is that the raw speech CNN, when fused along with the articulatory initialized CNNs, gave the highest performance, which shows that these are all learning complementary information. The second task is depression detection, where given a speaker's utterance, detect the presence of depression. So the dataset consists of DIALECT corpus, which is depression analysis interview corpus, wizard of Oz. The training contains 103 sessions. That means there are 103 patients who were evaluated for depression, and then they were given labels based on their PHQ-8 score. So the training consists of, it's a very small corpus where the training has only 7 hours of data and the testing has 2.9 hours of data. So we used an architecture which is 4 convolution layers followed by a fully connected layer. And then the output was one output node which has a sigmoid activation, which will give us the probability of being depressed or not, given the input 250 millisecond input frame. So what we did was, for each speaker's utterance, we got these several predictions and then we averaged the depression probabilities per speaker and then we thresholded it to get the results. So here I have shown 2 baseline systems, which is lower level descriptor and functional based systems trained on support vector machines. And the other one is spectrogram based CNN method. And then what we have compared here are several methods that I have briefly touched upon. So what we see is that the raw speech signals is giving not so good results, whereas the filtered signals, especially zero frequency filtered signal, is giving the best performance. So here are 2 methods. One is subsegmental modeling. Again, the kernel width is 30 samples, and in segmental modeling, the kernel width is 300 samples. So we also went around to see what the first layer frequency response or what these networks are learning in general. So the first convolution layer reveals the immediate response of the CNN to the task. So what we can visualize is the average frequency response, where we just take the frequency response of all the filters in them and average them. So what we could see is that in raw speech, when we model raw speech in depression, it was focusing more on the mid frequencies, whereas the zero frequency filter is focusing more on the lower frequencies, which corresponds to the source information and giving better F1 score. We have seen similar trends in segmental modeling. Segmental modeling inherently focuses more on the lower frequencies because the kernel width is long, so it has good frequency resolution. Another kind of analysis that we can do on the entire network is using relevance analysis, where given a pair of input segment and a target node, we can compute the activation at a particular node of interest and then back propagate it to get what is called a relevance signal. So this relevance signal indicates the most informative input samples for the classification. So we also used another technique called guided back propagation, where the negative gradients are omitted from the relevance computation. So what we saw in the case of relevance analysis, what I have shown here is zero frequency filtered signal superimposed by relevance computed from subsegmental modeling network and also using segmental modeling network. So what we can see is that subsegmental modeling gives sharp focus on the positive to negative zero crossings, which corresponds to the glottal closure instance. And we can also clearly see that the subsegmental modeling gives a good time resolution because it has a sharp focus, whereas segmental modeling is quite smeared across time. However, when I plotted the autocorrelation of all these 3 signals, we can see that the fundamental frequency information is captured by both segmental modeling as well as subsegmental modeling. So I'll get into the conclusions of the thesis. So the first conclusion the thesis draws is that end-to-end acoustic modeling demonstrated viability in speech assessment tasks. The architecture was inspired from previous speech recognition and speaker verification studies, and we tested it on automatic speech assessment, and the performance was on par with the existing methods. Changing the first kernel width alters the information that is learned, which is subsegmental modeling versus segmental modeling. So we also tried filtering speech to enhance source-related information. It improved modeling and performance over source-related low-level descriptors in depression and fluency tasks that I have not shown in this talk, but it did not help in the dialect prediction task. We also investigated integrating articulatory knowledge. It learned complementary information and provided or improved the dialect identification tasks, but it showed limited gains in fluency prediction task, and it did not improve the depression tasks. It is also worth mentioning that the filtering approach was also tried on Alzheimer's detection by a colleague of mine in collaboration with me. And also in terms of integrating articulatory knowledge, it was also shown on predicting the degree of sleepiness from speech. The proposed linguistic segment level training that we have proposed in the context of phone posterior probability based method has improved hybrid speech recognition systems as well as dysarthric intelligibility speech assessment. It handled the duration variations in the data better. And the final contribution, the pseudonymization method that we have talked about, has demonstrated unidentifiability of speakers in the ABX listening tests. It improved speaker verifiability than the McAdams method, which is one of the baselines. It also improved the word error rate and objective intelligibility than the two baseline methods. And it also improved subjective intelligibility, quality, and speaker linkability than the two baseline methods. So there are a few publications that were based on this thesis. You could go to either of these sites. In the EDAPS publication page, you can search for my name and see the publications. And there are also several other publications that that happened during my PhD. Some of them were not part of the PhD thesis, but were quite insightful. Thank you so much.